November 13th, 2022, just after midnight for University of Idaho students were in their off-campus home. Xana Kernodle in the kitchen, Madison Mogan and Kaylee Goncalves in the living room, and Ethan Chapin in his room. Suddenly, their lives were violently interrupted. All four students were brutally stabbed inside their home. The quiet college town was thrown into shock. Families, friends, and neighbors struggled to understand how such a tragedy could happen. Who could commit such a horrifying act? Why target these students? And how did authorities eventually uncover the truth? Welcome back to Prison Stories. In this video, we'll dive into the chilling case of the Idaho College murders, exploring how four students lost their lives, how authorities pieced together the investigation, and the shocking revelations that eventually pointed to the accused, Bryan Kohberger. In the small college town of Moscow, Idaho, four friends were living what appeared to be a quiet, ordinary student life. Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogan, both 21, have been inseparable best friends for years. They shared the upstairs floor of their rented house on King Road, finishing their college days together. On the second floor lived Xana Kernodle, 20, who often had her boyfriend Ethan Chapin, also 20, staying over. Xana was studying marketing. Ethan was a freshman majoring in recreation, sport, and tourism management. To their classmates, they were just another group of students enjoying young adulthood. The house itself, a 3-story off-campus rental, was a well-known student hangout spot, filled with laughter, music, and the usual rhythm of college life. Nothing about it suggested that something unthinkable was about to happen. On the night of November 12, 2022, everything seemed normal. Kaylee and Madison spent the evening at a local bar called the Corner Club, just a few blocks from campus. Later, they grabbed food from a food truck downtown before heading home. At almost the same time, Xana and Ethan attended a fraternity party at the Sigma Chi house nearby. By around 1:45 a.m., they too made their way back to the King Road residence. By all accounts, it was a typical Saturday night in a college town. Friends out late, laughter, fast food runs, and then returning home in the early hours of the morning. What no one inside the house could have imagined was that, within a few hours, their lives would be violently cut short. The following morning, November 13th, 2022, the quiet home on King Road was anything but ordinary. Around 11:58 a.m., a frantic 911 call was placed from inside the residence. Police arrived to a scene that stunned everyone. All four of these students were brutally murdered in their own home. The killing sent shockwaves through the small town of Idaho. For years, it had been known as a safe, peaceful college community where violent crime was virtually unheard of. Now, in an instant, fear gripped the campus, and the entire nation's attention turned to this once quiet town. Neighbors described the area as one of the safest places you could live. That illusion shattered with the news of what had happened inside 1122 King Road. Investigators were immediately faced with a horrifying question. Who could have committed such a brutal crime and why? The brutality of the murders suggested it was a targeted attack. At first, detectives weren't even sure who the intended targets were. Was it a random act of violence? Or had someone specifically come for one of the students? The uncertainty only fueled rumors. Online forums and social media were flooded with theories. Some pointed fingers at boyfriends, ex-partners, even friends and neighbors. Nearly everyone connected to the victims became the subject of public suspicion. Then came the first real lead. Surveillance cameras from a neighborhood captured a white car speeding through the area in the early morning hours, just around the estimated time of the murders. That car was identified as a white Hyundai Elantra, and soon it became the centerpiece of the investigation. Detectives across state lines began reviewing license plate databases, security footage, and traffic cameras to trace its movements. But investigators didn't stop there. At the crime scene, forensic teams collected evidence that would prove crucial: a knife sheath left near one of the victims' bodies. On it, they recovered a single male DNA sample. With these two puzzle pieces, the mysterious car and the unidentified DNA, detectives finally had the beginnings of a trail to follow. As investigators traced the Hyundai Elantra, they discovered it was registered to a graduate student at Washington State University, just a short drive from Moscow, Idaho. That student's name was Bryan Kohberger, a 28-year-old criminology PhD candidate. FBI surveillance teams began quietly following him. They watched his movements, his habits, and his car. What stood out was how closely his vehicle's travel pattern matched the timeline of the murders. On the night of November 13th, data showed his car leaving Pullman, Washington, driving toward Moscow, then returning just before dawn. Still, detectives needed something irrefutable. That's where the DNA on the knife sheath became critical. Agents began watching Kohberger's family home in Pennsylvania, where he had traveled for the holidays. They collected trash from outside his parents' house and ran it against the DNA recovered at the crime scene. The results were clear. The DNA from the sheath was a near-perfect match to Kohberger's father, which meant the killer was his biological son. This was the break investigators had been waiting for. But who was Bryan Christopher Kohberger, and how he was related to these murders? At the time, Bryan was living across the state line in Pullman, Washington, a short drive from Moscow, Idaho. He wasn't some drifter or career criminal. In fact, on the surface, his life looked almost the opposite. Kohberger was a 28-year-old PhD student in criminology at Washington State University. He had already earned a master's degree in criminal justice and was teaching classes as a graduate assistant. By all appearances, he was the type of person studying the criminal mind, not someone anyone expected to be accused of such a brutal crime. Friends and former classmates would later describe him as socially awkward, deeply interested in psychology and crime, and at times unsettling in his conversations. But to the outside world, Bryan Kohberger was simply another graduate student, living a quiet life in a nearby apartment complex. It was only when investigators began piecing together the evidence that this seemingly ordinary academic would be revealed as the prime suspect. On December 30th, 2022, police finally made an arrest. Bryan Kohberger was taken into custody at his parents' home in Pennsylvania. The arrest was not just another step in the investigation. It was the moment the case shifted from speculation to reality. When Kohberger was extradited back to Idaho, cameras captured his first court appearance. He stood emotionless, avoiding eye contact with the victims' families who filled the courtroom. He spoke only to confirm his identity, while his defense attorney entered a plea of not guilty to the charges of 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary. Besides solid DNA and footage of his care, police also presented in court his phone records that showed his cell phone had pinged near the victim's house multiple times in the months leading up to the murders, almost as if he was surveilling the place. And on the night of the killings, his phone suspiciously went dark for several hours, only to reconnect later near the crime scene. And then there was the most haunting detail. A surviving roommate reported seeing a masked man with bushy eyebrows leaving the house in the early morning hours, aligning with the timeline of the murders. Together, these elements built a case strong enough to not just arrest Kohberger, but to formally indict him for 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. Bryan Kohberger was brought to trial. Prosecutors laid out their case by presenting forensic evidence, digital tracking, and eyewitness accounts that place him at the scene of the crime on the night of the murders. Kohberger maintained his innocence throughout the proceedings, entering a not guilty plea. His defense team argued that the evidence was circumstantial, but the prosecution's presentation, including DNA linking him to a knife she found at the crime scene, proved to be pivotal. The court case drew nationwide attention. Families of the victims sat through the hearings, listening to the details of the night their loved ones were killed. Emotions ran high in the courtroom, with moments of visible grief and anger as testimony unfolded. Bryan also pled guilty later in the face of overwhelming evidence. Ultimately, the jury was convinced by the overwhelming weight of the evidence. Kohberger was convicted on all charges. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he will spend the rest of his life behind bars. The sentencing brought a measure of closure to the families, though the pain of their loss remains. Despite the conviction and the life sentences, the central question still hangs over this case. Why did this happen? Bryan Kohberger has never offered an explanation. When given an opportunity in court to speak before he was sentenced, he simply declined, and judges and prosecutors have acknowledged that a clear, satisfying motive may never be known. Investigators say the evidence shows planning and targeting. Evidence against him built a case that proved he committed the murders, but they stopped short of answering the deeper question of why he chose those 4 students that night. Reporters, criminologists, and commentators have floated several possible explanations, everything from a dark fascination with violence to misogynistic obsessions and online subcultures. And some accounts suggest he may have fixated on a specific person. But those remain theories, not proven motives. For the families and the community, the lack of a clear reason only deepens the pain. The trial may be over, and Bryan Kohberger will spend the rest of his life behind bars. But the shadows of this case still linger. The evidence told the story of how he was caught, yet the question of why remains unanswered. For the families, the friends, and the community of Moscow, Idaho, justice has been delivered in court, but closure is something far harder to find. Thank you for watching Prison Stories. If you found this video informative, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Stay with us as we continue to uncover the darkest stories of crime.